Hello and good morning, and welcome into the newest episode of Big Talk College Sports with a Midwest perspective, blue collar and blue blood. I am your host, Sam Sprunger, as always, at least recently. Tony Hollinsworth from Inside the Hoosier Mind is filling in for the interim and potentially longer. How are we today, Tony?
I am good, sir. It's a beautiful Friday. For anybody who's not in the Midwest, it snowed here in Indiana yesterday. It had a little bit of a little snow blurries and whatnot. It was beautiful. I know a lot of people hate it, but I'm a fan of the very gray aesthetic, especially being colorblind. Doesn't really affect me that much either. But I like the snow. I like the kind of bad weather and whatnot. It reminds me of soup chili season, and most importantly, it reminds me of football, but even more importantly, it reminds me of basketball season.
Yes.
Most specifically college basketball season.
Oh yeah, we're right in the middle to where it's crossing over. It's starting to get interesting in the college realm or the basketball realm, but then also we've got the throes of football wrapping up a season that has been interesting to say the very least, with all the teams that are performing well, and then the ones that are maybe underperforming or historically not looking very good.
Fair enough.
But yeah, a lot happening in the Big Ten on both of those fronts. But let's start with football, Tony. Let's get the recapping from last week. Kind of a excuse me, one of those weeks that not necessarily a ton of high marquee games. But some games that had some ramifications on some teams that maybe didn't win. Nebraska, I'm looking at you, but had a very good opportunity to do so and become bowl eligible for the first time since 2015. But they fall short to USC 28-20 in Southern California.
Yeah, and I think I remember us talking about it last week. If you look at Jaden Mava, I'm going to just say Mava because I probably butchered that last name.
I think it's Mava. I think it is Mava. So that's what we're going to go with.
Say there's like three vowels, like all in like sequence right there. So it's throwing me off, to be 100% honest with you. But for the fact that he comes
Mayava,
Mayava, that might also be possible.
Yeah.
But the fact that he comes in, this is his first start for the Trojans as they bench Miller Moss. He comes in, he goes 25-35, 259 yards, 3 touchdowns, and a pick. I mean, you really can't ask for much more out of a guy that's getting his first start of the season so far. USC's run game with Marks, 19 carries, 146 yards. I mean, really, USC did everything that you were really supposed to do. Far as you hear the old adage that, hey, all you got to do is score at least 21 points and you'll win the game. And they held Nebraska to 20 and they scored 28. I will say, though, on the other hand, for Nebraska, it's really disappointing at the slide that they've taken. This was a team that I had a lot of high expectations for. I know
I did too.
You and I even talked about it. I had them honestly going undefeated into the Columbus game. I thought, okay, they're going to be 7-0. We thought at the time going into Columbus. I thought, okay, Columbus will probably be their first loss. Then they'll kind of rebound, and then they may or may not lose a game again until they face, Wisconsin, until they face Iowa. And then we thought potentially, depending on how USC would do, we thought USC might even be a trap game for them. But the fact that they've fallen now to 5-5, it seems as though Nebraska has just really been broken ever since all of those losses have now started to really accumulate and just pile up ever since. And I'm really not sure what the issue is. Yes, Nebraska has had some injuries, but you still have your main star piece that is really the future for Nebraska. You still have Dylan Raiola up. Matt Rule really seemed like he had turned everything around at the beginning of the season, but now it seems like ever since they got to the halfway point and beyond, they've just completely spiraled out of control now. And for me, I just really don't understand why, because of the potential and the expectations. Not saying you got to go out undefeated, but you were supposed to have a significantly better season than what you're standing out at 5-5, 2-5 in the Big Ten right now.
After the first week of the season, when Nebraska beat Colorado, you really thought that might have been, okay, that's a statement piece. Nebraska's back.
Yeah.
Excuse me. It started with Illinois. It was a good game. It was back and forth. Illinois took away the run game that Nebraska had and really was able to make them so one-dimensional that they were able to beat them, I think, by field goal, right?
It was a touchdown. They lost 31-24. Okay. Yeah.
So, I mean,
that's still close. Like you weren't
one possession. You
Yeah.
weren't blown out. And ever since then, it is almost like they went to Bloomington, they got dismantled, and that was the end of the road. They've been on 5 wins since like week 6. Yeah. And they just can't get that win. They just can't put 4 full quarters together to win a ball game right now. And it's really kind of a tragic thing to think about, because you're right. We had them both, look, this is such a favorable schedule. They might lose a couple at the end, but honestly, they should be looking at a 9-10, maybe even an 11 win season, and probably flirting with the new college playoff system. And now we're standing here 10-11 weeks into the season. They're 5-5, 2-5 in the Big Ten, and it just doesn't make sense.
And here's the other thing too, when I look at their schedule. So if you look at all of their games, Illinois, they only lost by a touchdown. Right. They beat Rutgers by a touchdown. Now they get blown out by Indiana. All of their losses, it's the same thing that they've had in previous years past. They're losing by 8 points or less. Like, you think about it. They took, at the time, number 4 Ohio State. They kept it within 4 points. They even had a lead at one point. It was 17-14, and Ohio State gets the game-winning touchdown. You look at last week against UCLA, they lose by 7. Then they go to USC and they lose by 8. Like you said, it's mind-boggling that this is a team that apparently can even hold their own with the likes of one of the nation's top 4 teams with Ohio State, and you can't seem to be able to put it together for 4 quarters to bring home the win. And like you said, you've been stuck on 5 wins forever now. All you got to do is get one more, and you can be bowl eligible. In all honesty, these last 2 weeks, like we even talked about at the beginning of the season, when we thought that, they could probably win 9, 10, 11 games, we thought, okay, they're probably going to lose to Ohio State. But, man, either one of these 2 games we think is very winnable, but also very losable. I feel like this is honestly, and even still with their downward slump because of how close they've kept it with all of these games, I still feel like it's a coin flip between really both of these teams throughout the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, with the remaining 2 that they've got, which is
Wisconsin and Iowa.
Yeah, I was trying to think of the last week of the season. It's always Iowa now, and honestly, with the way Iowa's playing, you never know what team is going to step on the field against you. So it's one of those for them that you can't bank on it. You've got to try to get this W. It almost feels like a must win, because now if they go into the last week of the season sitting at 5-6, it's going to feel like they're climbing a stinking mountain just to try to get back into, or get to be bowl eligible. And while it will still be celebrated, it has to be looked at as a pretty disappointing finish to a season that started with pretty high hopes.
Yeah, and it's not going to come any easier too, because if you look at Iowa's remaining schedule, they travel to Maryland and then they host Nebraska. Iowa right now is sitting at 6-4. They're 4-3 in the Big Ten right now. So I mean, it's very possible the Hawkeyes could finish 8-4 with just how they are as a team. And like you said, there's a lot of questions with them offensively. Now, I think they have played better offensively, but they've also played a little bit worse on defense, because you look at the last few years, that defense was really able to carry them to 9 and 10 win seasons, to even win the Big Ten West back in the time. So it's really surprising to see kind of how far Iowa has kind of fallen off, but it's more surprising to see how far Nebraska has. And really, honestly, yes, if they get bowl eligible, it is a quote-unquote successful season for Nebraska, because you haven't been to a bowl game in almost a decade.
It's a backhanded successful season.
Correct. It's a very it's a very low bar, sad, successful season, because this is really like, this isn't the ceiling, this isn't the middle. You're all but on the floor, maybe just one step above the floor of where you needed to be at this point, and where a lot of people probably thought you would be at the beginning of the season.
And see, I wouldn't even be saying this, and we've spent a lot of time on Nebraska, surprisingly enough. But
I know, don't be great.
It would be different if they started the season struggling and were
Right.
at 5-5,
and turned
but they
it around.
started so strongly that you thought, hey, yeah, they're really they're going to be something this year, and they just haven't been able to finish the deal. So they get another chance this week. We'll talk about their game this week here in just a few minutes, but let's get on to some other games here. UCLA coming off of a couple of big wins, feeling kind of good. They go on into Seattle and they get beat 31-19 by the Huskies. The Huskies improved to 6-5, 4-4 overall, or in the Big Ten, 6-5 overall. UCLA now is in the position where they were looking kind of good of, well, maybe they can pick off Washington and get one of the last two of the season and become bowl eligible. Now they have to have both of them. They have to win this week, and then Fresno State, I think, is who they wrap up their season with. And that is, it's a difficult path to a 6-6 season, which we just got done talking about one team that if they get to 6-6 after losing this week and they win the next week, it's kind of a disappointing 6-6. UCLA finishes 6-6. That's a pretty darn good season for a Bruin team that you really didn't think much of.
Yeah, when I looked at all of the former Pac-12 teams coming into the Big Ten, UCLA was like, all right, if I have to rank them 1 through 4, UCLA is my 4. You know, I had them at 4. I had Washington at 3. I had USC at 2, and then I had Oregon at 1, as far as who I thought was going to be probably the best competition coming into the Big Ten. And like you said, if they are able to go 6-6 after this, with the fact of you had a new quarterback coming in, you had a completely new head coach with Chip Kelly going over to Ohio State as their offensive coordinator. You know, you've got basically an entirely new system. You're coming into a new conference as well, and you're able to finish 6-6. That is a really good season for the Bruins, to be 100% honest with you, because I thought, okay, UCLA's coming in, and welcome to being the new punching bag of the Big Ten. Because again, prior to this season starting, I was like, well, you get to fight with Indiana, you get to fight with Northwestern, you get to fight with Purdue, you get to fight with maybe Rutgers, you get to fight with everybody for the middle to bottom tier spots of the Big Ten. Welcome.
Yeah. And it would be a successful season. Honestly, if they finish 5-7, I'm going to say it's a relatively successful first season for Deshaun Foster. It's what they were expecting. They have overachieved to a certain amount, but they fall to the Huskies to make that road to bowl eligibility a lot more difficult. Because now they can't afford a trip up. They use their mulligan right away on the last 3 to get 2 out of 3. Now they have to go 2 out of 2, and it doesn't really get easier this week for the Bruins, even though USC is struggling too. But that was a game that happened last Friday, and I was a little not surprised that Washington won, but that it was a 2-score game. That was kind of what caught me off guard with how well UCLA had been playing. But let's move to the next game. We'll go over just a couple of more. There aren't many more to look at anyways, but just a couple more real quick. Oregon, number 1, Oregon travels to Wisconsin, to Camp Randall, and comes out with a 16-13 win over the Badgers. Tony, it was 10-6 at the half. Wisconsin was up. It was 13-6 at one point, and then the fourth quarter happened, and Oregon was able to overcome their slow, sluggish start at Camp Randall and take the Badgers down.
Yeah. And it's funny because if you remember, we talked about this last Friday. We said, you know,
Yeah.
if there is any game at basically the end of the season for Oregon that they might trip up against, you know, you look at Wisconsin and Camp Randall, that it's a hard place to play. And they even got to play it in Showtime as far as being at night. So I mean, this is probably about as one of the toughest road opponents that they could have faced. The only other probably more difficult one would have been, instead of Ohio State having to travel to Eugene, they would have had to travel to Columbus.
Yeah,
That
that
maybe would be a little bit more difficult, but Wisconsin for years has probably been one of the actual, you know, absolute top 10 or even top 5 toughest places to play in, not just in the Big Ten. I would even argue in college football as a whole. What's really kind of surprising though is Dylan Gabriel didn't exactly play poorly, but he didn't play great either for a guy that, all honesty, you can argue he's probably in the top 5, top 3, maybe even conversation for the Heisman Trophy right now. And he goes 22 of 31, 218 and a pick.
He didn't even have a throwing touchdown like that.
No.
His stat line includes the interception he threw.
Correct. Now, they did have a lot of help from their running game. They had 25 carries for 121 yards and a touchdown from it. But that it is kind of weird that we see a little bit of the Oregon that I think we saw at the beginning of the season, that struggled against, you know, Idaho State and struggled against Boise State. Like it does kind of make you wonder, is Oregon going to come up to this point where maybe they're starting to feel a little bit too cocky, and they're starting to maybe, you know, look past opponents and looking ahead towards the future, like, you know, we're already 11-0. We have one of the best conference records for the Big Ten. They already have a qualifier for being in the Big Ten championship already. So they already know they're there. So are they potentially going to just say, these last couple of games don't matter, and maybe trip up? And it's like, well, if you do that, no, you're not hurting your chances of being in the Big Ten championship, and you're not going to hurt your chances in the playoffs. However, you're going to hurt your seeding chances. And then it doesn't help you as far as hosting a playoff game goes. But that's not exactly what you want to do if you're supposed to be the clear-cut number 1 team in the country right now.
Yeah, well, at this point, I think you're gonna get everybody's best. So when you've got to go at night to Camp Randall and play Wisconsin, who's 5-4 at the time that they play you, they end up putting forth their best game, and I think I don't necessarily look at the fact that they only won 16-3. They went into an environment that is raucous. It's loud. It's very difficult to play in when you're the visiting team. They trailed into the fourth quarter by a score and ended up winning. They put the finishing touch. And you're right. Dylan Gabriel, you're kind of surprised to see that. But at sometimes, both games, the running game and the passing game, are working for Oregon. Wisconsin's got to pick something to beat.
Yep.
And it looks like they ran and played their money on stopping Gabriel and hope for the best, and it just wasn't enough. So I'm not too concerned, really, honestly. At this point, you're 8 conference games in, and you're gonna get some close calls, I think. And the Ohio State one and the Wisconsin game, these are Oregon's close calls at this point. And not that you don't want to take note, I guess, but you don't necessarily need to be concerned, I don't think.
Right. Yeah. And like you said, I think everybody that's going to be coming in is going to be giving Oregon their absolute best. Because, I mean, you think about it, what better way to project yourself? Now, your season might be over. So really that kind of makes these guys some of the more dangerous teams to play, because they got nothing to lose. Like, okay, we'll go for 2 on every touchdown that we potentially score. Why not? We'll go for a fake punt. We'll, fake a field goal and try to run it in for a touchdown. So, I mean, these are some of the most dangerous teams you're going to have to play. And to be honest with you, they're probably some of the best testings that you have to be able to do, because you're going to have to be able to get over that. And, they're going to get one more in the team that was honestly has been their boogeyman for the last couple of years. They have to, host Washington next Saturday to end the season. In all honesty, that could very well be a trap game. Oregon's the more talented team on paper. Washington lost everybody as far as the transfer portal and whatnot, but
graduation.
You talk about a rival that came with you from the Pac-12. Nobody knows you better than your rival.
Yep, you're absolutely right. Number 2, Ohio State travels to Northwestern to Chicago, Wrigley Field, playing at the friendly confines. Handles Northwestern relatively easily. The only reason I really brought it up is because I wanted to say they played at Wrigley Field, but they won 30. They beat the Wildcats 31-7 in a game that is kind of a prep for this week's game that we'll talk about here in just a couple of minutes.
There is a little bit of worry though, because that Northwestern game cost Ohio some pretty costly pieces. One of them being their star transfer center from the University of Alabama, Chase McLaughlin, out with a Achilles injury. Is Achilles or ACL?
I don't remember.
I think it was ACL. It started with an A. I know that one, but nonetheless, though, his season is over. So they've unfortunately now lost, one of their key pieces on an already pretty shaky offensive line that they've had to really piece together over the last, 3 or 4 weeks.
Right.
And so we've still seen a dominant Buckeyes team, but we've noticed they kind of get off to a slow start because they were down 7-0 to the Wildcats at one point. Not saying that there's going to be an upset, but you're kind of like, wait a minute, you're down to Northwestern? Timeout.
They were admiring Wrigley Field. Come on.
That's true.
Number 4, Penn State goes to West Lafayette, takes away a 49-10 win against the 0-7 Purdue Boilermakers, 1-9 overall. Oh my goodness! Did you see the Denylon Morissette catch that would have been a touchdown, but he was standing on the opposite, the out of bounds side of the goal line?
I did, and I'll be honest, and it's no slight to Purdue, but it's like that. I feel like that is kind of a perfect summary of the Boilermakers season of just like little stupid mistakes that is just absolutely just killing them.
I've seen people criticizing the grounds crew, and I'm like, that's been like that all year long. You can't blame the grounds crew for making the out of bounds in that area the same color. There's a big white line, all right? You see that, okay?
Well, and to a point too, if you're a wide receiver, you have to know your spot on the field. You have to know where you're at, because again, even in college, even in the professionals, what does everybody do? Where am I at? Am I in bounds? Is my feet in bounds? They're of that.
So pinpointed, they know how to get their 2 toes down just to be able, and how far they can go out to get it still.
Yeah, in midair while they're making some crazy catch and potentially taking a hit on top of it. They're like, gotta get these little toesies in here. Gotta make sure
those piggies gotta go home.
they gotta get to market. They gotta get to the market.
Yeah. So Purdue, not I say easier game this week because it's not the number 4-10 Penn State Nittany Lions this week, but it doesn't get easier for Purdue even with their last 2 games. It just they're hapless, but I've got an interesting take coming to after we talk about this week's games. Michigan State falls in Champaign to the Illinois Illini 38-16. Aiden Childs, though, 23 or 40, 256 yards, 2 touchdown passes for the Spartans. He is an extremely bright spot for the future for what Jonathan Smith's got going on in East Lansing.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people who are Michigan State fans, this was kind of to be expected, to be honest with you. It's a transition. Yeah. It's a transition from the Mel Tucker era. Michigan State had a lot of really good pieces leave, but one of the big issues that I think Michigan State has had the last couple of years, even with Mel Tucker, was you had all the pieces there, but you couldn't get them to play well together. Yeah. And we've noticed that with a lot of coaches across all of college football. They're great at recruiting, they're great at bringing transfers in, but they don't play well together, and it shows on the field with a losing record. You're not able to stop the run, you can't pass. So with Jonathan Smith coming in this first season, and he brings a bright spot like Aiden Childs in, and again, for the fact you threw 2 touchdowns and 256 yards in a loss against a pretty decent Illinois team, to be honest with you, it is a bright spot, and I think the future is very bright in East Lansing, not only with Childs but with Nick Marsh, the 4-star wide receiver out of Michigan State that a lot of people were thinking was going to potentially transfer, be poached. Now that may or may not still be the case because LSU just lost their number one quarterback. But again, the thing with college football now, though, whenever the season first starts and that person is wearing the uniform, then we'll see who they're truly committed to. Because honestly, up until that point, between money, between NIL, great, the school's performance itself, coaches, everything, nothing is set in stone in college football as far as transfers go.
Yeah, and right now Michigan State's sitting at 4-6. They play Purdue this coming week. That should be a win, and then they have Minnesota to wrap up the season. Those are 2 winnable games. They could be bowl eligible, but even if they go 5-7, honestly, from what they were last year to this year, they're markedly better and they're trending up, in my opinion.
Yeah. And you notice there's not as much as the spotlight because the drama and all of the craziness and everything like that is no longer on Michigan State and Mel Tucker, because again, you look at how much money they paid him, to get him there. And then everything that he brought with him, it's like, okay, you're not really meeting expectations. Jonathan Smith is the very quiet under the radar. I very much what I think that they're looking for and what they need there in East Lansing again.
Yeah, well, let's move to the final game from last week, and the only reason I'm going to bring this up is because Ethan Kaliakmanis and Kyle Monangai led the Rutgers Scarlet Knights to a 31-17 win. Kaliakmanis had 2 touchdown passes, 31-17 over the Terps. They become bowl eligible after being right on the cusp, kind of like Nebraska, but for only a couple of weeks. They become bowl eligible, so Greg Schiano is taking the Knights bowling.
Yeah, which good for him. It's cool to kind of see Greg Schiano now in the second term with Rutgers, and they kind of the same thing. They start out really hot. It's like, okay, Rutgers, not necessarily expecting them to beat Ohio State, but maybe they'll be a little bit more competitive than what we thought. And yeah, they were just on the cusp there as far as, can they potentially do it? I will say for everything that has happened with Maryland, the fact that, they've now had to move on from Talia Tungavailoa, all the big pieces that they had there, Maryland for a long time, they're sitting there at 4-6. Big shout out to Billy Edwards for how well he played in this game, even though it was a loss.
300 yards throwing.
Yeah, 335. He did have a touchdown and a pick, but I mean, that's pretty good. And even now, statistically, his stats don't show it because he's only thrown 4 touchdowns to, I believe if I did my math correct, that's 7 interceptions in his last 5 games. But, he's thrown for just doing a little bit of quick math here, almost 1,500 yards in those 5 games too. So, I mean, yes, he's a junior. He could potentially transfer out. I think if he does, he's going to be one heck of a pickup for anybody that takes him.
Yeah.
But as of right now for Maryland, for what they have and for what he has to work with, he's honestly having, not a bad season, almost 2,900 yards, 15 touchdowns and 9 picks for what Maryland is. That's pretty damn decent.
And Maryland, one of those head scratcher teams, we thought that they were going to be a lot better in the facet of they're not going to be 1-6 in the Big Ten.
Right.
They have a lot of talent still on the roster, and Coach Micah Loxley, he's a good coach for what Maryland should expect from a football program. They're more of a basketball program. That's just the way they're built, and that's fine. But he's pretty good for the Maryland program, and I just don't know if I've heard some grumblings that maybe he should be let go. I don't know who you get though. That's the thing is can you what Kirk said Cignetti is doing at IU is everybody wants to be the next program that finds that guy. You know what I mean? And so a lot of times you maybe see the grass being greener on the other side of the fence, but when you get there, it was just because the wind was blowing the right way. It's still that dull green. You got to get somebody that matches your program. And I thought it looked like Michael Oxley's done a relatively good job in his tenure at Maryland. So it'd be interesting to see where they go from there. If they say, you know what, we think this was a blip on the screen, on the radar, and we're going to get back to what we're used to. That very well could be the way the Terps go this year.
Yeah, and I know we've even talked about it because we kind of inkled to that when we first heard the rumors that Mike Loxley might get, the boot for being the head coach of Maryland. Like you said, I think for what Maryland is, the fact that it is a basketball school, they don't really have a lot of money as far as NIL because they don't really have a lot of boosters that are going to invest in the football side of the program and the school as a whole. And again, you really have the chips stacked against you. You were in a division at the time with Ohio State, with Penn State, Michigan, Michigan State, depending on the years. Then you got the Big Ten West with Iowa, Wisconsin, Purdue. So considering the fact that they roughly finished right about 500, either one game below or one game above, that's about as good as you're going to get for Maryland, considering the fact of, the program that it is. There's not going to be a lot of football players go there because that's not necessarily a huge pipeline school straight to the NFL. So like you said, everybody wants to catch a Coach Cignetti, but let's be realistic too. How many times do we ever see that in a college football season? And the most important thing that I feel a lot of college teams, fall victim to is you have one hot flash of a season, so you give them a super long-term lucrative deal to lock them up, and they don't do this thing of, let's see the consistency before I start paying you almost $100 million for 10 years, and then I'm stuck with you for 3 or 4, and then I got to hope that I can get boosters to donate enough money to be able to buy you out of your contract. Ask Texas A&M, ask LSU, ask Florida with Billy, all these guys that got massive contracts.
Nebraska.
Ask Nebraska with Scott Frost, ask Florida State with Mike Norvell, guys that probably shouldn't be there anymore. And we need to somebody needs to mention, hey, you should probably go back to this whole 3-4 year deal thing. That way, if it doesn't work out, we're not completely hurting ourselves for damn near a decade because we're trying to pay off a debt.
Yeah, well, I think what they do that for is, okay, if you're going to leave, you're going to leave, but the buyout for you to leave is going to be pretty hefty to those donors at the new school that you're going to. So you better make it worth your while to do that. I think that's probably the driving force behind the 8 years or the 8-year deal, and probably one of those that the coach is like, well, if I can't replicate this, at least I've got a huge buyout. So it's a benefit to both of them, because if, let's say, school A is this rinky-dink little school that it has a really good coach. Let's say IU. I've been saying this about it, and he just literally signed a new extension, 8-year extension. So
I think the same day we talked, the next day after we talked about it too, he signed on that Saturday.
So Kirk Cignetti signs a new 8-year extension after less than one season at IU. That's IU seeing the writing on the wall, and it's Kirk Cignetti saying, you know what, I have confidence, but at the same time, what if I can't replicate it again? That's IU saying, you know what, people are going to come sniffing this year, so we've got to get him locked up to where the buyout's big enough that it has to be a big enough move for him to make. I still think, even though he just inked a new 8-year extension, he is going to be heavily pursued, and he may say no this year, but how confident is he that he's going to replicate it? And if he's confident, good for him, good on him, go do it. But I wholeheartedly feel still, and it's not because I'm a Purdue fan, it's because I've seen it happen so many times. I use a stepping stone. It's not a blue blood program that's been revitalized to football greatness. No, they've never been good. They have never had 10 wins in a season.
Yep.
So I think they really were probably hedging their bet to say, you know what, if somebody wants him bad enough and he wants to leave bad enough, the donors are going to have to pony up the cash. So we've got a big windfall coming in because they struck while the iron was hot.
Right. And who knows, maybe they use that. And I don't know what the rule is, but heck no, who knows? Maybe they use that and they invest it more towards the basketball program to get the basketball maybe more invested as far as more play money to bring guys in.
Yeah. I don't know exactly the logistics of where the buyout goes to when it goes to a school or whatever, but it'd be like next year he goes 0-10.
Right.
If IU wants to try to fire him, they're going to have to buy him out. So,
right.
And I think it's good for Cignetti in the aspect of he's got a guaranteed amount of money. If he gets 4 years into a deal and he starts looks like IU's back to IU, historically they can let him go and they'll have to buy him out. He still gets a big chunk of money as he leaves Bloomington, or he's going to go to a bigger and better, or a bigger, more blue blood program, and the donors are going to pay that pay IU the money to get out of it.
Which, speaking of, I don't know if you know this or if you saw this, you probably did. I just want to say there is a stepping stone for you and I to maybe become head coaches. You could potentially become the head coach of the Purdue Boilermakers, Sam. And I say that because on Indeed right now, or at least it was the other day, there is a posting on Indeed for the head coach of the Kennesaw State Owls football team on Indeed.
It's on Indeed, huh?
On Indeed. It is. And I thought, okay, this is just an internet meme. Somebody made a troll. Nope. I legitimately went to Indeed. I looked in Georgia. Sure enough, there it is. Head coach for football for Kennesaw State. So if you could get them to more than 2 wins, Sam, they only got 1 so far. If you can get them to 2 wins, you might be golden, buddy. Hey, who knows? You could be the thing is they're
probably getting rid of Walters this year, so I'd have to write it out till the next coach.
Hey, all you gotta do just at least 2 years. Same thing. Lock up your real big deal, and then Purdue just comes calling. You're like, you know what? Let me just go ahead and sign on the dotted line.
Yeah. Well, here's to hoping, right?
Hoping and dreaming.
That's right. Let's move quickly. We've spent way too long on last week, but let's talk about some games this week. There are a couple of good ones. We talked about a little bit about the USC UCLA game. That's at 10:30 p.m. Tomorrow on NBC. From the Rose Bowl, the Bruins host the Trojans. The Trojans, let's say it this way, they're underperforming greatly. From what we expected, but they go into this game still a 5-point favorite.
Yeah. And fun fact for anybody who doesn't know and anybody who hasn't looked this up, believe it or not, the most expensive tickets right now out of all of tomorrow's matchups, Ohio State and Indiana is $84 as a ticket, and USC UCLA, they're as low as $126 a ticket. Like you said, to me for USC, the fact that you're coming in post Caleb Williams with Lincoln Riley, they do have a new defensive coordinator, so it is a little bit of a new defensive system. Mm-hmm. And the same thing for USC. You're coming into a new conference. Yes, you do get the benefit of – actually, I don't think they had to face Oregon this year, so they got the benefit of they didn't have to face them.
UCLA did, but not USC.
Correct. So you do have a little bit of benefit and you have some kind of familiarity with some of the opponents that you're facing. But for the most part, you're taking on an entirely new conference of opponents. The fact that you're sitting there at 5-5, and I believe they're 2-5 in the conference, if I remember correctly.
I think you're right.
So you've definitely had some struggles, especially on the road. You've done a lot better if they come to Los Angeles, but that was something that we've talked about, even before when they first joined. You guys are a lot of fair weather, warm weather teams. If you have to go to Camp Randall in November, if you have to go to, Lincoln in December, it's going to be a really rough time for you having to try to deal with a lot of these cold weather games. But going up against USC, I think mainly just for the continuity and the fact that, honestly, you pulled out a big win against a team that, is in the same boat as you as far as being desperation and trying to be bowl eligible. And USC kind of keeping that streak going now that Caleb Williams left. I think they honestly should keep that edge and keep that 5-point favorite over UCLA in the Rose Bowl.
Should.
Keyword should.
We'll see if the Trojans get there. I would be. Well, it doesn't get any easier for them. They've got to go and play Notre Dame next week, so that's going to be this week's game. Is going to be their best bet to get bowl eligible for the season. If they fall to the Bruins have the inside track of to be the only bowl eligible LA team this year. The winner of this will be the only bowl eligible LA team. How about that?
Right.
Unless USC shocks the world and beats Notre Dame, I just don't see that happening. Though.
I don't either. I mean, who knows? NIU did it, but then NIU has also fallen off the trail. But hey, Army's also facing them, and Army's undefeated right now. And believe it or not, College Game Day isn't going there. Big Noon Kickoff isn't going there. A little bit of surprise on that, to be 100% honest with you. I expect a little bit more coverage.
A little bit of a slight on the Army team. That's this week, isn't it? They play this week. Yeah. So Notre Dame doesn't have an easy one this week, but go Army.
All they got to do is stop the run in their set. That's all they got to do.
Let's go back to the games this week. Tonight, Purdue travels to East Lansing, take on Michigan State. We talked a little bit about that in the aspect of this is an easier game for Michigan State to get closer to bowl eligibility as they sit at 4-6. They're a 13.5-point favorite. I think that's a good spacing. I don't foresee Purdue's riding the storm out. It really does seem like they're riding the storm out. If there's any thought in my mind of maybe a glimmer of hope of winning any game this week or the rest of the season, honestly, I think their best bet's next week. And I know that sounds absurd, but I definitely we'll talk about that a little bit after we talk about the next game that we're going to talk about on the slate. But what do you think about this Boilermakers Spartan matchup?
Yeah, I kind of like the almost 2 touchdown favorite. I do feel like that's kind of a good spot. Like you said, I feel like Purdue is really riding the storm out. I know at one point I believe they benched Hudson Card, if I remember correctly.
And I think he's back to playing now. So
yeah, which all honesty, I don't feel like that makes any difference for him. I feel like and again, I don't know. You would know better than I do. I have not watched any of the Purdue football games this year. I don't want to say it's coaching because we've seen what Ryan Walters can do as a defensive coordinator, but as a head coach, maybe a little bit more to be desired. But I just don't know what it is about Purdue to really give like an accurate, they just need to get a little bit of this together and whatnot. I've seen a little bit more out of Michigan State. Just with how we know Jonathan Smith is as a coach, and the potential that Hayden Childs has. We've seen what they were able to do with Nathan Carter at the running back and Nick Marsh. I think it should be a pretty easy Spartans win. And like you said, depending on how the next game we potentially talk about goes with IU, maybe next week might be the best chance Purdue has as far as winning their first conference game and winning their second game of the season.
And bookend the whole entire season with 2 wins. How about that? They go to the first game tomorrow. We already talked about the last game. Let's talk about the first game. It's one of a triple header that kicks off at noon tomorrow. The 5th ranked Indiana Hoosiers go into Columbus to take on the number 2 Ohio State Buckeyes. Ohio State right now is at a 10.5-point favorite with an over-under of 52.5. Tony, what do you see going on in Columbus tomorrow?
And keep in mind, too, that's dropped. So on Tuesday.
Yes, it has. Yes, when it was over 14.
Yeah, when I did my show on Tuesday, it was 13.5 on Tuesday, and it's since dropped to 10.5. And I think a lot of that comes to, like I alluded to earlier with Chase McLaughlin being out, their star center transfer from Alabama. There is a lot of questions, and we even talked about it last week. Is Coach Cignetti going to have this team ready and prepared, or is it going to be, are they coming off of the typical bye week, maybe a little bit of ring rust, kind of not necessarily the Mike Tyson out of the first and second round, maybe the third round type of, ring rust type of thing. But I do think that Indiana is going to play this a little bit closer than to be expected. And I say that mainly because of more of really what we've kind of seen the lack thereof out of Ohio State. And we've seen it for the last couple of years. While Chip Kelly has done better this year of trying to gear it more towards the running game, that offensive line has taken a lot of injuries over the season so far, and they've kind of had to, piece it together and do a lot of makeshift offensive line. So I think Indiana's defensive line maybe matches up a little bit better now. I still think Ohio State will come out with the win, but I don't think it's going to be an absolute blowout. I think if they win, it won't be more by a touchdown.
So this is rough. Really rough. I've been thinking about this game. That's what one thing that makes it rough. I've been thinking about an IU game most of the week. But the even rougher thing is I think IU wins this game. Yeah. It's not going to be hands down just blowing them out, but I think they stick around. And just the way the things have been falling for the Hoosiers up to this point, they've had a couple of games where they've really had to fight for a win leading into this game. Then they got a week off to get healthier, maybe rest a little bit more than they normally would at this point of the season. I think they come in rip roaring and ready to roll. I honestly, I don't know that having witnessed what we have from Kirk Cignetti's teams at this time in the Big Ten for 10 games.
Yeah,
we have seen them get up every single time. It doesn't matter if it was the first game of the year or last week or 2 weeks ago when they played Michigan. They came ready to play. They struggled against Michigan State out of the chute, fell behind 10-0. We're able to understand, hey, you know what? We're not going to be able to get it all back at once, so we're gonna get it back in chunks. And they went on a 47 to nothing run to end that game, winning the game by 37 after trailing by 10. So they've got that. Then they had the Michigan game where they had a comfortable lead going into the half, and then they struggled in that second half. So they had to hold on. They had to hold on tight. They know the situation. Doesn't matter that right now Indiana only has wins over non-ranked teams. At the time that they played those teams, they were ranked. So they have beaten every ranked team that has come into their path up until this week. And so I don't think that they're not battle proven a little. They don't have the same schedule. I sent you that graphic about Ohio State. This is the third top 5 matchup Ohio State will have been part of all this season.
Yeah,
it's the first time ever in the school's history for IU. I don't know that they shrink to that immensity. It doesn't matter. I don't think that they are, it's the first time they've ever played a top 5 ranked opponent while being ranked in the top 5, because they never have been, or if they have been, it's been way many moons since they have been. It just, I think the way IU is playing, they're going to hang around, and they're going to take advantage of something that happens later in the game that gives them the slight edge to pull out a field goal win against Ohio State, and giving them the inside track to the Big Ten championship game, which I think they fall short of because I think Purdue beats them in the bucket game.
Oh, well, here's the thing though that you have to remember though. So if they beat Ohio State, then, and say they lose to Purdue, they finish at 11-1. They still have the better record, because even if Penn State wins out, Penn State lost to Ohio State. That
is that how they go into, if they don't have a head-to-head, as common opponents? Well, then so there we go.
And I mean, you think about it too, like if they can beat Ohio State, that would be, I would say that would also be a more significant win than what Penn State has too, because then, okay, you beat the number 2 team in the country, like. Yeah, so
I am not as confident on the Purdue beating IU part of that scenario that I just gave. But I feel relatively confident in saying that I think IU is going to beat Ohio State. I don't think it's going to be a runaway. If they played 5 more times, I would take Ohio State the other 5 times. It really is. I think the way it's working, it's the unknown right now. Ohio State doesn't know how to play IU right now.
Right.
They know how to play their game, but at the same time, we've talked about there's been a few chinks in the armor that we've seen from the Ohio State offense with some injuries to their offensive line. And IU's got a good defense.
And
no two ways about it.
And I'll say this too, and it's going to sound like a slight to the other teams, but I'm gonna be honest, they have not faced a coach like this season except for Dan Lanning, because you look at all the other coaches they faced, it's teams that are pretty much for the most part used to getting beat up by Ohio State. Like, again, is James Franklin a good coach? Yes, he is, because he's good at recruiting overall. As long as it's not Michigan or Ohio State, James Franklin can beat them with the absolute best of them. But when it comes to Ohio State, he just absolutely struggles with doing that. And like you said, they don't know how to play this Indiana team, because this is an Indiana team coming in with a new sense of momentum that they haven't seen before. Honestly, they haven't seen an Indiana team like this since the COVID year, when Michael Penix Jr. was the starting quarterback for the Hoosiers at the time, and Ohio State was able to beat them 42-35 with Justin Fields, Chris Olave, Jackson Smith and Jigma, all those big teams, and they were only able to beat IU by 7. And they have a little bit of a dip as far as their overall talent now in that overall Ohio State locker room. They don't have the level of quarterback that they did then. I do think they have them beat as far as the running back duo. Wide receivers, yes, Julian Smith is fantastic, and Emeka Egbuka is consistent, but then after that, it's a whole lot of guys that haven't really had a chance or really haven't made a name for themselves so far in this season. So I do agree. I think that if Ohio State wins, I don't think it's by anything more than a touchdown. But again, I won't be surprised if IU doesn't come out with the win. Like you said, with the resiliency they did against Michigan State, being down and saying, okay, we're just going to take it, piece by piece, chunk by chunk. You did a resounding, you held on to beat Michigan, and you did what you were supposed to do as far as, okay, we got to be able to get our stops when we need to get our stops. We know how to score on them. This is what we need to do. I think this is definitely a closer matchup than what people expect.
Yeah. It's going to be an interesting matchup to watch, but let's keep moving on. A couple of games that we're not really going to talk about too much. Illinois 25 Illinois travels to Piscataway to take on Rutgers at noon on Peacock. Iowa travels to Maryland also at noon on the Big Ten Network. Couple of games that really not a lot to talk about on that, but the one I want to talk about before we start wrapping things up here, Tony, is number 4 Penn State traveling to Minnesota, 3:30 game on CBS tomorrow. This is an interesting game because Penn State is playing relatively well. They struggled against Ohio State to get their offense going, but since then, relatively well, producing some points against Purdue. But getting back on the saddle. But Minnesota coming off a really confusing loss the last time they were out against Rutgers. But Minnesota they're 6-4 going into this game. They're hosting Penn State. It's their house. They have some different types of layers of defense that might be able to take care of Ty Warren, at least keep him a little bit more at bay, the tight end, because Penn State doesn't have a ton in the receiver core after Ty Warren. But Penn State enters this game as an 11.5 point favorite against the Gophers.
Yeah, with an ESPN matchup predictor of almost 75% chance of winning. Yeah. I do agree. I think, honestly, if Minnesota can figure out how to shut, Tyler Warren down, I think it gives them, honestly, a better shot at potentially winning. Because there's really 2 questions about 3 questions almost that has really made it wonder for me. Is Drew Aller really that good of a quarterback and that they still believe in, or is he just the best guy that they just currently have on their roster right now that they have to go with? where is that Penn State rushing attack that we've been kind of used to seeing over the last few years? I feel like that's non-existent. And that defensive line came in with a lot of hype and a lot of potential. And I feel like that defensive line has not performed to the expectations that I kind of had set for them. Even like we talked about before the Ohio State game, that they ended up losing. They were down big against USC, and they managed to fight back. But for a team that's supposed to be as talented and hyped up as Penn State is, for them to even get to that point is what's really surprising more than anything.
We're sitting here talking about Penn State like they're a 3-loss team, and they've only got one loss, and they're ranked number 4 in the country. So they're far from being on death's door, so to speak. But they seem like they've got a lot bigger holes than even IU, honestly, at this point of the season. That the Nittany Lions may be looking on the outside looking in. If things fall out the right way for other teams, they may be left holding the sack.
Yeah, 100%, because, like we talked about, there's a potential that they may even miss out on not just the Big Ten championship, depending on how some of the things fall. And, say Ohio State does lose to Indiana, then you have to look at, okay, well, what is that loss to Ohio State for Penn State look like then? Like, maybe Ohio State's not as good as we thought. So maybe that drops them even lower, and maybe not necessarily out of playoff contention, but they might be on the fringe and needing some other people to potentially take some losses to kind of help save that season too.
Yeah, it'll certainly be an interesting game to watch as kind of a dessert to the IU victory over Ohio State.
Oh, you're calling it, huh?
I don't want to. I really don't. But and you know what? I won't be upset if I'm wrong either. That wraps up this week's episode of Big Talk. Tony, why don't you go ahead and let everybody know how they can find us?
So you can find us on Facebook at Big Talk. That is B1G Talk. Replace that I with a 1. We're not all Big Talk. We're just Big Talk. We're different. Not same, different.
No. They're good people, but they're not us people.
Correcto. You can also find us on Instagram, the app formerly known as Twitter, aka X. You can also find us on the TikToks at big_talk. Again, that's B1G_talk. You can find us there as well. You can find us every week on the All Sports All Plays Network, which you can get on your local app store, depending on if you have Android or Apple. Either one, you can get both. And our host Sam here is gracious enough that he posts this wherever you get your podcast on the Lounge Media Group shortly after this episode airs this morning.
Yes, sir. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming in to Big Talk, college sports with a Midwest perspective, blue collar and blue blood. For Tony Hollinsworth, I'm Sam Sprunger, and we'll see you later.
Bye.